Hello, everybody. The lights are on and we are ready to get started. Today is our first day, and you are watching AP US Government and Politics Live. We're going to be talking about voting rights and models of voting behavior. But first, I need to give you a little bit of a rundown on who I am. So my name is Jennifer Hitchcock, and I am an AP Government teacher at Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology. And in these first couple of minutes, I just want to kind of go through what we are going to be doing every day, as well as touching base on today's lesson overview. So every day when we come into this space, when I start talking and the lights turn on, you will find that I will start us off with this lesson overview where I will present the big question for the day, which will tell you what it is that we're going to be doing, why we're doing it, and then it's going to give you a way to touch base and make sure that you're getting what you need to out of this content. You'll also see that I'll have an agenda that will tell you the basic overview of what we're doing and then connections. It's important for you to recognize that in this space for the connections to course content, I will be addressing what we'll be touching on that I hope you've learned already. And a lot of that is going to be Unit 1. So that's the Constitution and Federalism. And I'll also touch back on the acquired skills and content that we're looking to develop today during that class space, and also the content that we want to touch base on. So I know so many of you have so many questions, and I want to start off about our virtual instruction structure before I get going on the content. This is going to run every day from 3 to 3:45 from March 25th. That's today to March 1st. May 1st, I'm sorry. So one of the things that people have been asking me is, what are we going to be talking about? And we're going to have a rough outline here because we're still kind of fleshing out the details, but you can expect that we will spend about 10% of our time talking about Unit 1, and a lot of that Unit 1 stuff will be folded into content we already know. We'll also be talking about Unit 2 about 35% of the time. Unit 3 and 5 will be 30, and I know that doesn't add up quite right, but that's because we've got some flexing to do, and I also have to insert a little bit of Unit 4 in there. So once we get things going, I will make sure that you know the daily schedule. And about that, I want to read to you something really quickly from College Board, because one of the questions I got from a lot of people, you'll see that blue font is usually kind of me anticipating student and teacher questions. And I know the one question everyone says was, why doesn't this match College Board's announcements? So here's what I want to share with you. Today, the topic we're covering is one that colleges have asked that all AP students study, even if it will not be on the exam. Colleges are supporting AP students this year by allowing this more flexible approach to the exam, where it will focus on a lesser amount of content than in other years. But in turn, they have asked that AP students learn today's material. To make this relevant to your upcoming exam, I'm going to include some exam prep in today's lesson. That's our skills. In a week or so, after we've covered some of these key outstanding topics, I'll be posting the full schedule of review topics for the remainder of this course so that you can choose which topics you want to prioritize for review, and thus which classes you'll want to attend. So another way of looking at this that I would explain to my own students is that hopefully you sit for the test and you do amazingly well and you score a 3 or a 4 or a 5, and the college that you want to go to accepts that. Well, our also hope is that you're going to go on for sequent coursework, like a poli-sci 150 level class. And this would be a prerequisite for that. So we need to make sure that we're covering core content that you would be expected to know so that you can be successful in those sequent courses. The other thing is we want to ensure that you're getting college credit. And we want to make sure that we're covering all of the material that's on the syllabus so that colleges have faith that you have been exposed to the sequent material. So that's kind of the way that I look at it and the way that I would explain it to my own kids. Now, what you can expect, and I know that you're on YouTube right now, and this is, yes, very live. Like, I'm going to make mistakes every day. I'm going to trip over my words. I'm going to say silly things. It's totally fine because it's a live structure, just like I would in my own classroom. But down in the comment section, you'll notice that I've already posted and I've started a Google Drive that has materials that I'm sharing with you. That's extension, some stuff for self-assessment, suggestions on where else to go if you need to dive deeper into this content. And then there's also some really critical preparation materials that I will include for the next class. If you can't access it, it's probably because your account that you're trying to access it with has some kind of firewall protection. So I've already had people who've requested access, and when I go in and I try to give you access, because it's my Google account, my private Google account, I can't give it to you. I get a little note that comes back and says that that whatever your organization is has some kind of barrier for me sharing. So I would suggest that you just sign out of whatever you're signed into with your browser. If you're on Chrome, usually you sign in, and sign in with something else that's a private email so that you can get a hold of those things. You'll also note that the chat's disabled, so that means that, I'll figure it out, kind of what's happening if you have further questions. Okay. So our daily instructional sequence is, like I said, agenda. We'll have warm up and review. We'll get to our need to knows, that's content, and then we'll get to guided practice, which is skill, and then we'll review. And all of that in 45 minutes. So let's practice that. So we're going to go into our warm up. And my first question for you is lowering the voting age to 16 constitutionally permissible today? So this is our catch question. I'm going to give you 20 seconds to think about this. 20 seconds of silent contemplation. Okay, I think that's 20 seconds. Probably timing me, and I probably got it wrong. But the answer is, of course it is. So this is going to touch back into 1.5, but before we get to that touching point, I want to just kind of take a look at this graphic organizer that I've borrowed from Generation Citizen, who is an organization that advocates for civic education and engagement with young people like yourself. So they put together a white paper that is explaining to interested parties, to students who want to get involved in special interest groups, who want to do volunteering work in their community, about how to address lawmakers. And at this point, it's going to be at the state or local level to advocate for lowering the voting age to 16, because that's where you would go. We're going to talk about why in a minute. But if you take a look at this map, you'll notice that there really isn't a ton of patterns that I can see. For the most part, like, I'm not seeing any kind of, if we look at our map and we think about what political, like, where people live, where they might be conservative or more liberal, it's really difficult to see a strong pattern. Probably the best that I would see would be out there in our upper Midwest, in Nebraska, Iowa, so on and so forth. So, that really means to me is that this is maybe not something that is as liberal or conservative as an issue as one might think. But this gives you some examples of where you might go should you decide, if you live in Maryland, which Maryland does in Tacoma Park. What's up, Tacoma Park? They do allow 16-year-olds to vote in city elections since 2015, I believe. So that is a really amazing opportunity that they have to start that civic engagement at a young age and to get into the habit of voting every single time there's an election and so on and so forth, which is really easy because half the time that stuff happens in schools. So let's dive a little bit deeper here in terms of why we're looking at cities and states. Remember from topic 1.5, when we want to challenge or change the Constitution, there's a two-step process. And it is, the first step happens at that national level with either Congress or a national convention going ahead and voting on some proposed constitutional amendment. They have to have 2/3 vote of all the member parties that are there, whatever it might be in Congress or in the convention. And then once it comes out of that national level, it's going to continue on to the state level. And you have options. It can go to the state legislatures, it can go to state conventions, but you have to have a 3/4 vote. And that is really, really hard. That's why of over 10,000 times that we've tried to amend the US Constitution, we have a 27% pass. 0.27%, 27 tenths of a percent, or whatever. Math is not my strong, guys. Math, so hard for me. Of the time, statistically speaking, you would see those formal changes happen. So that tells me that getting a constitutional amendment for 16-year-olds to pass might be really difficult constitutionally. You'd have to find 38 states that say, yeah, we're cool with that. And you'd also have to find some kind of national, either convention or Congress, to get that passed through in the first place. So how can we change things informally? Now I want to sidebar for a second and give you a little hint here. Oftentimes when we're looking at questions, we see the term formal or informal, and they mean something really critically important. So make sure you slow down and think about what's being asked. If we ask formal changes, I'm going to flip back here for a second, we're talking about a constitutional amendment. However, that happens very rarely, as we know, and so that means that we have to look at informal changes. And here are some of the ways in which those informal changes can happen. It can happen through action through the legislative branch, action through the president or the governor. It can happen through court action, through party action, through technology. And depending on what book you read, there's a couple other ways that it's often presented. But long story short, informal is much easier. And so we can go further than this to see why we would go informal. And that has to do with where powers are given. So if we look at our Constitution and we're trying to contemplate where the authority to regulate voting qualifications come from, there's 3 places in the Constitution. The first place we would stop is with the 10th Amendment. Everybody loves the 10th Amendment, right? The power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited to the states, are reserved to the states or the people respectively. Riffing a little bit there. This is where you'll see the concentrated authority to set qualifications found for states. States are allowed to go ahead and to kind of stretch their wings at making qualifications. And anytime we make a qualification, it's another way of saying we're classifying groups of citizens, those who can vote and those who cannot vote, on certain different facets. So we'll get to those facets in a minute. But we want to know, before we leave this slide, well, how does the federal government get involved? And there are 2 different sections in the Constitution that help us understand that. First place, if we want to know how the federal government regulates federal voting qualifications, they're tied back to whatever the qualification for the most numerous branch of the state legislature. So you'd have to go back and take a look. It's generally called the lower house. For me, I live in Virginia, so that's the House of Delegates. So if I can vote for the Virginia House of Delegates, constitutionally, I'm allowed to vote for my representative and my senator. So kind of bringing it back to that tells us that there's a federal regulation allowed for us to be able to come in and to make some determinations there with that clause. The second component of this, and this frequently comes in for state and federal, is the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. So it says that the state can't deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And usually what we think about there is we're thinking about classifications that we might call suspect, right? Things that kind of feel a little weird when you're saying these are the haves and these are the have-nots, but we will get to that later. So in class, if you were sitting here, we would talk about, okay, so then what's happened with these expansions of suffrage? We've had all of these amendments, these rights-bearing amendments that allow people the right to vote. If we go way back to before we even had the American Revolution, we would find that the class of people who were allowed to vote was an incredibly small class of people. They were male, they were white, they were Anglo-Saxon, they were Protestant mostly, and they were property owners. These classes of individuals were a super select few. people that felt that they had some kind of vested interest in the continuation, in the growth of the country, so on and so forth. And since then, we've had lots of different kind of approaches in terms of who has a vested interest in our national government. So we look to the states. Of course, we're talking about some unevenness here in terms of classes of voters who are here because each state's making a determination on their own. But roughly around the 1790s, we start to see religious qualifications fall off. In the early 1800s, we start to see an expansion through states where they lose property requirements because of the experience through the War of 1812, the Revolutionary War, going back there a little bit and out of order, but also in just the democratization, Andrew Jackson and his move towards bringing more people into the fold. And that will continue. So it's predominantly male, white, not Anglo-Saxon, not property owners. And then we'll move into the Civil War, and we know that shortly after the Civil War, we are going to pass the 15th Amendment, which is going to allow the Black community, Black males, to vote. So that happens in the 1870s. We start to see this expansion in voters, and then there's a contraction that starts from the 1890s to around the 1900s, about 10 to 15 years, in which we see a contraction of voting rights, and that's going to be for our Black males who are going to be experiencing repression and some suspect classifications that don't rely, and we'll get to how they miss that, but that kind of get at race without getting at race. We're going to come out of that in the 1920s. We see another expansion with the passage of the 19th Amendment. And I hope you guys know it's the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment this year. We have the 24th Amendment, which is in the 1960s. We have the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, the 26th Amendment. Those are all going to be our final rounds of suffrage expansion in the United States. So I told you we're talking about suspect classifications of individuals here. We're starting to establish or carve out the federal government through this amendment process, starting to carve out exceptions in which the state can't make suspect classifications, and they're on things like race, they're on things like sex, they're on things like socioeconomic status. So those classifications as it relates to voting are not allowed. They are explicitly barred. But we just talked about Jim Crow. We just talked about the Mississippi Code. How did we have this contraction if the 15th Amendment was passed? It just doesn't seem to make much sense. And the answer here is if we look at the text of that amendment, the 15th Amendment, that bars this action through states, we'd have to dig down deep and see what does it really say. Words matter. What it says is that the rights of citizens cannot be denied or abridged on the account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So this creates an exception. We can say that a state cannot say that Blacks or Hispanics, I'm getting ahead of myself. Hispanics is not included because that's a nationality, and we're going to talk more about that next class. But Blacks or Asians, those are races. That's not a condition in which suffrage can be allowed or barred. So that is it. Anything else that's outside of that is permissible. And so if we think about this, we see those bars on that classification. But there are other ways in which states can create classifications of those who can vote and those who cannot vote. Things like felon status, which actually has roots in the 14th Amendment, in an explicit allowance of states to disenfranchise anyone who has felon status. Things like the ability to present identification, residency requirements. Many states require that you're in place for a certain amount of time. Maybe it's a month, maybe it's 2 months, but it changes, and that's permissible. Geographic location. Most of us, all of us, vote in polling precincts. You can't go and turn up to a precinct that you're not allowed to go, that you're not tied to geographically, unless the state has made an allotment to erase some of those boundaries. Things like being below the age of 18, we just talked about that. Citizenship status, registration, those are all things that the states have created as a way of classifying those who can and those who cannot vote. So guided practice, how do we turn this information into something that helps us tackle our quantitative analysis FRQ. And so I'm going to turn to some work by Dr. Michael McDonald. He is a professor down in Florida, and right now the name of his university escapes me. Dr. McDonald, I'm so sorry. He is amazing. He has this huge database full of information on voting eligible population turnout rates. So when we're thinking about this, another way of putting this is that these are the people who can vote, who are eligible to vote based on whatever the law might say. And we're taking a look at it, who amongst those people shows up to vote. So if we have that in mind and we turn to looking at the VEEP turnout rates from 1789 to 2018, we may start to see a pattern or a trend. Now, I want to talk to you for just a second about the difference between trends and patterns. So this might be a little bit busy, but I really wanted to have it all in one slide. The first thing, when we're talking about trends, it's a generalized directional change within a data set. It doesn't have to be perfect. I gave you an example here of something that probably would never happen in real life. But if you see a positive slope, we call it a positive correlation, that tells us that for every 1 unit that you move across the x-axis, you're moving up a subsequent unit or a subsequent amount of space in the y-axis. So whatever those two variables are on your x and y, it's really important for you to check out to see what the x and y-axis is labeled as. The converse of that is a negative correlation, where we start to see for your every advance in unit on the x-axis, you see a decrease, right? So we're looking for generalized patterns. Like I said, rarely do I see this, and I mean, I've never seen it, where you see this beautiful straight line, right? That is different from a pattern. And a pattern is a generalized repeating sequence across a data set. Again, this is like a perfect scenario. It's telling us that it's very measured, it's very predictable. Is it going to be like this when you're looking in a data set? Probably not. But if you think about it, do I see positive? Do I see negative? Do I see some kind of predictable thing? In particular, when you start to think about, well, what else is happening at the same time that might help you be able to pinpoint some of those patterns. So thinking about that, let's turn back to this slide. So now we need to think about all the things I just told you. Roughly when are things changing? When do we see, the suffrage amendments being passed, so on and so forth? And do we see any kind of association and change in the way that the data runs? So I look at this, the first place that I look at, I think, oh yeah, Andrew Jackson, right? Andrew Jackson, he loved to bring in the average man, mountain man, the average citizen, right? We're expanding suffrage, we're removing all of those requirements for property holding. And what we see, and this is logical, we see a corresponding rise in the voting eligible turnout rate, voting eligible population turnout rates around 1825 to 1850. Now you might see, and this is kind of an aside, you might see a delay, especially when we're talking about people, we're talking about changes in patterns, changes in cultural expectations. So sometimes things take a little bit of time. So with that in mind, as we march across this, we see this great increase here from the 1825 to around 1850. I see another blip, a teeny tiny little change in pattern here around the 1860s. And I should, because that's going to be the passage of the 15th Amendment. So there should be a little bit of growth as we pass the 15th Amendment and we start to see more Black males, especially in the American South, turning out to vote. They were able to vote people into office who were descriptively representative or who mirrored their demographic information. You're going to see Black members of Congress, so on and so forth. So we're naturally going to see a little bit of a rise here as well. However, we also see a little bit of a blip around 1900. And again, that should make sense because around 1900 is when the time period in American history when states who are going to start finding ways to classify individuals' right to vote on things like the grandfather clause and reading tests, literacy tests, and poll taxes, is going to have a subsequent impact on the Black community, but also for some of those, it's going to have a subsequent impact for poor whites as well. Our next one, 1925, we see a little bit of a little bit of a trough here, which might be explained by some of the world wars, but then a pickup as we see the passage of the 19th Amendment. And again, it's a little bit delayed because we have cultural changes here as women gain the right to vote. Same thing here in the 1960s. 1960s, 1970s. Passage of the 24th Amendment and the 26th Amendment are going to drastically expand. And you might be saying, but why doesn't it follow the trend of everything else? And one of the things that we'll talk about in the next couple of classes is that the one class of voters who tend not to turn up to vote, they're 18 to 24-year-olds. Hey guys, you are going to change that, right? You are going to change that. You are going to get registered to vote, and you are going to vote, and you're going to vote in every election because it creates a pattern of behavior. And that's the amazing thing about voting. So one more thing that I want to talk to you about, if I'm looking at this data set, besides sitting there and thinking about what I know about time, history, so on and so forth, I also want to make sure that I really know what I'm looking at. So this may seem a little, I don't know, silly, but I'm telling you, I've been an AP reader for a couple of years now, and every time I sit down at a data set, I can tell when kids take a really quick glance, when a response has a really quick glance at a data set, and I don't see the full capturing of what's happening. So you want your response, because I know that you guys know this. I know you know it. But I want to make sure that your response, that you pause for a second and that you say, okay, what are all the things that are being presented to me? Are there any oddities that I'm not picking up? So we're going to flip back and forth between this and this to make sure that we're all on the same page, right? So the first thing, we want to make sure that we can identify or name what's being measured, right? What's our unit of measure here? In this case, what's being measured? People, right? Voting eligible population. So we're taking a look at people. Fantastic. It could also be counties. It could be laws. It could be court cases. It could be so many things. But make sure you know what's being measured. The next thing you want to know is, what is the data set's construction? Really important. Is it across a period of time, or is it taking a slice of life and then kind of filtering out or creating classifications of different data sets, right? This is looking at all voting eligible population from 1789 to 2018. So this is time series, right? This is taking a look at time as we go. If we were looking at something where they broke it out for, and I know they're going to throw you off here because it's like presidential and midterms, just for the most part, don't overthink it for now. If we were looking at something that was taking a slice of life from 1 year, you might see they present you things like gender, race, religion, so on and so forth. That's cross-sectional, that's a slice of life, right? Single observation at one point in time. The next thing you want to make sure you understand is, how is the data set constructed? Is it a demographic set? Is it chronological, meaning over extent of time? Is it constructed alphabetically? Is it from the most of one occurrence to the least of one occurrence? This one, believe it or not, is where I see most responses going to the wayside, because sometimes people want to have innovative ways, or they want to really kind of like make a point with their data set. And so if you aren't keying into how that data is presented or curated, you could really go down a rabbit hole that you don't want to go down with your response. So really stop and think about what's happening there. And then again, go back to trends and patterns to make sure that they are true of the data set. And yay, that's it. So let's practice, right? So this is a quantitative analysis FRQ. This is the basic structure of what it will look like. I'm only giving you the first 2 points. C and D we'll tackle later this week. But what we want to see here is, in point A, the advice that I give to my own students is that we want to see in your response that you can work with the data, right? What's happening in the data to give us kind of a little bit of you flexing your muscle. So the question I have for you is, using the data presented in the chart, identify a period of rapid increase in participation from the voting eligible population. So think about that, and I'm going to read B. Describe a pattern in which data between presidential and, let me try that again. Describe a pattern in the data between presidential and midterm elections. You forgot this is live, didn't you? I didn't. Okay, so identify means name, right? That's really all we have to do at a baseline. It's like pointing your finger, but make sure that you give me like back, it's rooted in whatever the stimulus that they've given you, right? So I need to see that you're kind of, that you are rolling up your shirt sleeves and that you're like touching the data. So here, an example might be a period of rapid increase in participation from the voting eligible population was approximately between 1820 and 1850. Now, this is a baseline response. If I were advising my own students, and y'all are my students now, I might say, maybe you should illuminate the data a little bit. Maybe you should go on to talk about, maybe I would talk about, to make sure that I clinch that point, that starting in 1825, we went from around 10% VEEP turnout rate to 1850 with an 80% VEEP turnout rate in presidential elections. But whatever it is that you're going to talk about, you've got to use quantitative numbers, you've got to use labels, you've got to show in your response, because you're not there with the reader. The reader cannot make any presumptions that you know the content. You have to grab them by the face and say, I know the answer. So you have to explicitly tell them where you are looking in the chart, right? A pattern in the data between presidential and midterm elections after 1850. So I identified a pattern. First thing, I drew that straight line so that I'm not paying attention to anything prior to 1850. And I also made a mark here to kind of call out for myself what about 10% looks like, so that I can just take that arrow and just move it along. Now I know that it's not going to be picture perfect. It's not going to be, that 10% perfectly across the board. But it gives me a rough idea of what that pattern of behavior is. So our pattern is that the data between presidential and midterm elections after 1850, that the voting eligible population turned out in higher percentages during presidential elections, often by more than 10%, right? That's a pattern, not a trend, right? We're comparing the orange and blue line, and we're making sure they line up. Another piece of advice that I give to my students is that you always want to start your sentence off by repeating whatever the prompt asked you in a statement, right? When you do that, you are forcing yourself to make sure that you know exactly what's being asked. It's like a fail-safe to ensure that you're really asking the question that's being answered. Because remember, you've only got 20 minutes to do this. Sometimes when we are writing really fast, we read it really fast, and we go in the wrong direction. We don't let our eyes roll over all of the words that are there. So you really want to make sure that you repeat that prompt. It is causing your hand, your eyes, and your brain to register the full mystery of that prompt. Okay. So how does this impact elections now that we've done some practice together? We can see that we've had a ban on discriminatory action based on race, sex, economic ability, and adulthood. That's fantastic, right? What does it do? It boosts our representativeness in Congress. It might even boost that descriptive representation, which we'll talk a little bit more about as we go through the next couple of weeks. Remember, descriptive means hold the mirror up and that person looks like me. It's statistically more likely that they look like me. They look like me in my race, in my sex, so on and so forth. We might see that there's diversity in party coalitions, that you might have a higher likelihood of finding people in the party who look like you, who have the same economic realities as you, who hold the same job, who have the same education, so on and so forth. Those are awesome, right? We want more representativeness. We want more diversity. But it also increases expense in elections. Why? Because when you're running for office, you want to make sure that to the best of your ability that you have put your name and your platform in front of every voter that you think you have a choice in winning over. And when we increase our voting base, that means that there's more people you have to talk about. So think about that, because that has implications for campaign finance reform. The final thing here is that it's going to give us the opportunity to start to have tailored messaging that's geared towards these diverse subpopulations, which means that depending on who we're talking to, the message that's being given might take a different slice from our platform, might take a different trend in terms of how our story is formed, so on and so forth. And so now we're going to turn to our final component that we need to hit up for this unit topic, and that is, how do we tailor messaging? So there's 4 basic outlines here. We have rational choice. Rational choice is voting based on what is perceived to be in the citizen's individual interest. I know what's best for me, and I'm going to think about my bottom line. I hear that a lot, bottom line. It's kind of the opposite from party line voting. Party line voting might be somewhere where you just look to see, is there an R or is there a D after that person? You're looking for brand name recognition. You want to see a red name. You want to see a blue name. You want to see an elephant. You want to see a donkey. And you are going to vote for all of those things. Folks who like to vote party line also tend to do what we call, they will finish their ticket so that it is completely red all the way down as opposed to split tickets. It's called straight ticket voting, right? So you turn in your ballot and you've got all of the R's or all of the D's checked off, regardless of whatever that office is. I always kind of joke with my students that one of my favorite offices here on the state and local level in Virginia is soil and water conservation. And while it's not people don't have a party affiliation, they would definitely boost people completing their ballot, which is another concern we have in elections, that people don't complete ballots, by putting an R or a D after that. But there's a reason why they try to make it nonpartisan. And I say that, and I know that my students are going to check me to see if that is a partisan office or not. You guys can go ahead and check me and tell me I'm wrong. Tell me I'm wrong. All right. The last two is retrospective versus prospective. Retrospective, think of the past. It's retro, right? What did you do? What did you do last year? Let me look at your voting record. If you're thinking about special interest groups and they love to give grades to members of Congress who are running, that's kind of retrospective voting model. Whereas prospective, we're looking into the future, right? What promises do you have on the horizon for me? So we have about 10 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we get our check for understanding here. So I'm going to give you some, before I lose my camera, I'm going to give you some time here to think about these questions. I'm going to read them to you. The answer choices are always in the same order, but I want you to think about what you think the best answer is. All right, so Tom's parents were conservative Republicans. When Tom went to vote for the first time, many of the candidates and their issues were confusing to understand. He voted Republican. All right, think about it. You've got 10 seconds. All right. Did you get it? Did you get it right? I hope you did. Party line. It was so easy, right? Oh, come on, Miss Hitch. There was Republican right there. Right. We like that idea of straight ticket voting. Okay, next one. Tom, during his presidential campaign, kept asking voters one simple question. Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? Think about it. Did you get it? Did you get it? Retrospective? Of course you did. You're brilliant. All right, Tom is an independent voter. His choice will come down to weighing promises made by both candidates. As a college student with heavy debts, he is leaning toward the candidate that promised to make education more affordable. Think about it. And I know you got this one too, right? So easy. Perspective. All right, our last one. Before Tom decided to vote, he considered what would be best for his small business. Taxes were rising and healthcare costs were pinching his profits. The simple facts would determine his vote. Of course, process of elimination, right? All right, so before I move on to the next slide, I do want to say thank you to Mr. Dan Larson for letting me borrow his questions. His information, he has a fantastic website. It's down below. All right, so rational choice. Now, maybe you're thinking for a second, hey, this feels the same, right? The difference between the small business Tom and the independent voter Tom, like what's the difference? So let's think a little bit deeper here, right? I highlighted here what I think would bring us to this the best, right? We're thinking simple facts, really just being totally cold, unemotional, rational, logical, right? He's like, I don't care what party affiliation you are in, as long as it's better for my small business and the people that I'm supporting economically, that's all I care. So that logical weighing is what would bring us to believe that this is rational choice. Versus Tom as an independent voter, he's talking way more about promises from both candidates, promises to make education more affordable. That's future. That's looking to see what the future might bring us. And that is why we're going to go for prospective. Okay, so great question. Can we be more than one at a time, depending on the office? And the answer is, of course, right? Sometimes we might look at the down ballot races. That's a fancy word for just saying You know, right now we're getting ready for a presidential election, so I know that you all know the top of the ticket is the presidency, the presidential candidates. If you look down the ballot, you're going to see your House races. You might also see your Senate, because 1/3 of the senators are up for re-election this year, and then any other state and local thing that might pop up there. So that's a down ballot, right? We might have more information or feel more passionately about somebody who's in those down ballot races that might cause us to stutter step between those 4 different models. We also might think differently about the powers that have been delegated to each office. Maybe we love having expansive national powers for somebody at the national level, but when we come to like school choice and stuff like that, we want it to be more conservative, right? There are people out there who think that stuff is important. The next thing is persuaded by intangible factors like personality and trust, right? We might break how we would vote normally with our party affiliation based on things that are intangibles. Desiring cohesive party control, like you want to see that your party wins all of the offices at the national level, all of the offices at the state level, so that you are more likely to get policy that's beneficial to you. That's totally cool too. Or maybe we don't know enough about some of those offices and we suffer something called, one of my favorite terms, ballot fatigue. Phew, I'm so tired, I just can't finish that ballot. Okay, so I want to check back in. How did we do? Did you analyze citizen participation in national elections so that you can explain the balance between individual voting rights and regulatory powers of governments? Do you feel like you successfully practiced parts A and B of the quantitative analysis FRQ? I hope that you are well on your way to accomplishing those goals. So one of the things I told you was that I would be handing off to you something to do to practice in order for us to be prepared for next class. And I'm going to give you this. This is kind of breaking from the FRQ thing. Might be something that you would see in a multiple choice question, which I know what the announcement was, right? But we're still practicing skills. So using that infographic, how would you explain the right to vote and how it's regulated by state and federal governments? What I'm going to ask you to do, and we'll start class next time with that. So just to make sure that I'm giving you all of the resources that I have available to me. Number 1, down there in the links, you click on it, it's going to take you to this. You will see a couple of things that are there for you that are just parting gifts, right? Number 1, quantitative analysis, free response, student rubric. So this is a way for you to kind of have that. If you're at home right now and you have access to a printer, print this jam out. Have it next to you as we go through all of these things. This is something that I provided my students, and since you're now one of my students, now you got it too, to help you. And if you're like, but I really need you to just slow down and go through the quantitative analysis slower, then there's a link on the doc that takes you to, this is my quantitative analysis FRQ video. It's 23 minutes of me doing the exact same thing. Listen to some of it, listen to all of it, listen to none of it, whatever. It's there for you. You'll see that I explain the structure, I give you a prompt, and then I give you an answer. So that's just one more thing to help you. And that brings us pretty much to the end. I talked way faster than I thought I was going to. I hope that this has been helpful for you. Like I said, we'll have that calendar posted as soon as we can get it up there. We're still working on kind of like making sure that it meets all of the stakeholders' needs. Remember that, we really would love to see you be successful. So you have an opportunity to, once we've had that calendar up, to use those resources to the best of your ability to make sure that you're doing well on that AP exam, on that modified AP exam that was announced. And again, if you don't know what that modified structure is, then talk to your AP government teacher or check out College Board's website. They have all that information there. That's the best place to go to continue to be in the news and in the loop. And I'm going to show you my resources so that you know where I got and everything. And I'm going to say goodbye, my friends. I had so much fun meeting you, and I hope that you come back again tomorrow. Have a great night.